This is the remarkable account of how several brilliant Chinese scientists and researchers accepted Islam after examining the Quran. Initially, they looked down upon it, assuming it to be nothing more than an old religious text. But as they explored further, they were stunned by what they discovered. Many were brought to tears and eventually embraced Islam, because what they found were undeniable facts and scientific truths already written in the Quran centuries ago. Let's dive into this captivating story. And may those who subscribe be blessed with ease in their lives. Inside a state-of-the-art research center in Beijing, the tension in the conference room was almost tangible. Dozens of China's finest scientists sat in a circle, eyes fixed on a large screen that showed the title of a new research project. Normally, their work revolved around quantum mechanics, space missions, or advanced genetic studies. But today, their subject of investigation was something entirely unexpected. A religious scripture that was believed to contain scientific knowledge from over 1,400 years ago, the Quran. Professor Zhang, a leading astrophysicist, stood before the group with a firm and serious look. "The government has handed this project to us," he said, glancing at the title on the screen. "There are claims that the Quran contains knowledge that was far beyond human understanding at the time of its revelation. Our goal is to test those claims using modern scientific tools and methods." Some of the scientists couldn't help but laugh. "So, now we're supposed to validate a religious book through science?" scoffed Dr. Liu, a well-known biologist and outspoken atheist. "Isn't it obvious that science and religion don't mix?" But not everyone shared his disbelief. Dr. Wang, a marine scientist, responded calmly, "I've come across some verses that describe natural events quite precisely. Don't you think it's worth looking into how that's even possible?" Professor Zhang nodded in agreement. "Exactly. We need to determine whether these descriptions are mere coincidences, or if there's something deeper behind them." These scientists had spent their entire careers in pursuit of knowledge. But none of them had imagined that this particular assignment could change the course of their beliefs. Verses appeared on the screen, touching on topics from the formation of the universe to the intricate development of the fetus. These were concepts far beyond the reach of 7th-century understanding, yet somehow already written in the Quran. A book they once thought was just a religious tale was now beginning to challenge the foundations of their thinking. And so, in one of China's most advanced laboratories, a new chapter of discovery had quietly begun. As the lab doors opened, the group of researchers moved into the central workspace. The room was vast and packed with high-tech equipment, supercomputers, powerful telescopes linked to space satellites, and sophisticated analytical tools. At the center stood a massive display screen, listing several Quranic verses lined up for detailed examination. The scientists stared at the screen with a range of emotions, some intrigued, others doubtful, and a few wearing skeptical expressions. Professor Zhang walked forward and tapped a button on his tablet. "Let's begin with one of the major claims Muslims make about the origin of the universe," he said. "There is a verse in the Quran that says the heavens and the earth were once one entity before being split apart." The screen displayed the verse. "Do the disbelievers not realize that the heavens and the earth were once one mass, then we split them apart?" Quran, Surah Al-Anbiya, 21:30. Silence filled the room. Some scientists leaned in, eyebrows raised. Others quickly started searching databases for relevant cosmological theories. Dr. Sun, a cosmologist who focused on the origins of the universe, stared in disbelief. "This is almost word for word what the Big Bang Theory proposes," he murmured. "But, could it really be just a coincidence?" Professor Zhang calmly replied, "Let's explore further." He explained, according to the Big Bang model, around 13.8 billion years ago, all matter in the universe was concentrated in a single, dense point, which then expanded rapidly. This was only confirmed in the 20th century, after the discovery of cosmic background radiation. Yet, this verse has existed for more than 1,400 years. Dr. Wang looked visibly shaken. There were no satellites back then. No telescopes. Most people still believed the Earth was flat. Again, the room went quiet. The early chuckles and dismissive looks had disappeared. A new feeling had taken hold, curiosity mixed with disbelief. Professor Zhang continued, "There's another verse that speaks of the expansion of the universe." He brought up another verse. "And the heaven we constructed with strength, and indeed, we are expanding it." Quran, Surah Adh Dariyat, 51:47. Dr. Sun turned toward him in shock. "That's impossible. The idea that the universe is expanding was only established when Edwin Hubble observed it in 1929. Before that, everyone believed the universe was fixed and unchanging. How could this book know all of this?" Dr. Chen, who had been one of the most skeptical from the very beginning, was now silent. He stared blankly at the screen, his thoughts spinning in every direction. Professor Zhang looked around at his colleagues. "Up until now, we haven't found a single mistake in these claims. The scientific theories we've confirmed through modern research were only discovered in the last few centuries. Yet this book spoke of them long ago." Dr. Liu, who had openly doubted the study from the beginning, let out a deep sigh. "Is this really just coincidence, or is there something much greater behind it all?" No one replied. Each of them was lost in thought. But one thing had become clear: their previously firm beliefs had started to shake. They had entered this room determined to prove that the Quran was nothing more than an ordinary ancient book. But now, even that assumption was slipping away. Silence still filled the room. This advanced research facility, which usually echoed with confident voices and logical debates, was now heavy with doubt and reflection. The scientists, once certain of their scientific dominance, now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. The Quran had described the creation of the universe with such precision, as though it had come from a source with knowledge far beyond human capability. But their research wasn't over yet. The next stage was to analyze the verses that talked about the creation of human beings. Dr. Liu, the biologist who had remained skeptical throughout, stepped toward the main screen. He read aloud a verse. "And indeed, we created man from an essence of clay. Then we placed him as a drop of fluid in a secure resting place. Then we turned the drop into a clinging clot. Then we made the clot into a lump, and we made the lump into bones, and we clothed the bones with flesh." Quran, Surah Al-Mu'minun, 23:12, 14. For several moments, the room was still. Each scientist read the verse carefully. Dr. Liu finally spoke. "This is incredibly specific. The verse outlines the process of human development stage by stage, exactly how we now understand it." He paused, swallowed, then continued. "We only came to know all this after the invention of microscopes, after we were able to observe fetal development inside the womb. How could anyone have known this over 1,400 years ago?" Professor Zhang crossed his arms. "Let's compare this to modern embryological studies." They quickly pulled up scientific diagrams and data on fetal growth. The results shocked them. The verse described each stage with remarkable accuracy. "In the early phase," Dr. Liu said, his voice trembling slightly, "the embryo is literally just a clump of blood before it becomes flesh and bone. And yes, the bones do form first, and only then are they wrapped in muscle." Dr. Wang, who had been quiet up to this point, finally spoke. "This doesn't make any sense. These facts were only confirmed in the last century. But this book recorded them long before that." The atmosphere in the room grew heavier. No one dared to challenge what they had just seen. Their skepticism was slowly being replaced by something else: unease and awe. Dr. Huang, a forensic expert, began typing rapidly into his console. He brought up another verse. "Do humans think that we will not assemble their bones? Indeed, we are able to reconstruct even the tips of their fingers." Quran, Surah Al-Qiyamah, 75:3, 4. He zoomed in on a diagram of human fingerprints and displayed it next to the verse. "We know now," Huang explained, "that every human being has a unique fingerprint. Even identical twins don't share the same pattern. This is a cornerstone of modern forensic science." But how could this book highlight the uniqueness of fingertips over 1,000 years ago? Again, there was no answer. No one dared to speak. The room had fallen into another deep silence. Each scientist was immersed in thought, overwhelmed by the truth slowly unraveling before them. Professor Zhang took a deep breath. "We came here expecting to prove this book wrong," he said quietly. "But so far, we've only found facts, hard to deny facts." Some scientists now wore visibly anxious expressions. It was as if their lifelong understanding of the world was being torn apart. Dr. Wang broke the silence again. "I don't even know what to say. If it were just one or two verses that aligned with modern science, maybe we could chalk it up to luck. But so far, every single verse we've examined has turned out to be true." Dr. Liu, who had resisted this project the most in the beginning, now looked the most shaken. His eyes glistened as he stared at the screen. "If this is all true, if this book really is from God, then we've been living in denial our whole lives." The silence in the lab deepened. Some of the scientists slowly bowed their heads, trying to process what they had just witnessed. They had dedicated their lives to seeking truth through science. Yet the truth they had been searching for might have been preserved in a book they had always ignored. After several minutes, Professor Zhang finally said, "Our research isn't over yet. There are still other phenomena mentioned in the Quran that we need to explore. But I have to admit, it no longer feels like we're studying just any book." No one objected. Something inside each of them had begun to shift. And quietly, without even realizing it, the light of truth had begun to enter their hearts. Silence continued to fill the high-tech laboratory. These scientists, who had once believed that science was the ultimate authority, were now filled with questions, with wonder, and perhaps even with fear. They had just seen how the Quran described the formation of the universe and the creation of human life with precision that was supposed to be impossible for its time. And yet, their research still wasn't complete. More verses, more scientific phenomena awaited, and those would shake them even further. Professor Zhang pressed a button on his tablet, and once again, the massive screen lit up with the next verse to be examined. The next verse appeared on the screen. "And it is he who has let free the two seas, one sweet and palatable, and the other salty and bitter, and he placed between them a barrier and an impassable boundary." Quran, Surah Al-Furqan, 25:53. Dr. Wang, the oceanography expert, stepped forward and read the verse carefully. "It talks about two bodies of water that do not mix," he said. Professor Zhang nodded. "Yes. According to Islamic belief, there are two types of sea water that flow side by side but remain separate." Some scientists raised their eyebrows, clearly skeptical. "That's impossible," someone murmured. "Water is supposed to mix naturally when it comes into contact." But with today's technology, this phenomenon had already been observed and documented. Dr. Wang brought up the findings from their recent oceanographic studies. "We've identified this exact occurrence in places like the Strait of Gibraltar and the meeting point of the Amazon River with the Atlantic Ocean," he explained. "The difference in salinity and density creates a natural boundary that prevents the waters from mixing." The scientists stared at the satellite images displayed on the screen. The visuals showed clearly how the two waters met, but did not blend. Dr. Chen, who had doubted every step of this research so far, now looked visibly shaken. "Could someone in the 7th century have observed this with the naked eye?" he whispered. "How could Muhammad have known this?" The room grew heavier, the weight of that question pressing down on everyone. No one had an answer, but they were beginning to understand that what they were dealing with wasn't ordinary. Professor Zhang took a deep breath. "Let's move to the next phenomenon." He tapped the tablet, and the screen changed again, this time showing a verse about fire under the ocean. "And in the sea, there is a fire that burns." Quran, Surah At-Tur, 52:6. Dr. Chen instantly straightened up. As a volcanologist, he knew exactly what this was referring to. "I'm familiar with this," he said quietly. "Underwater volcanoes." All eyes turned to him. "There are cracks along the ocean floor where lava is emitted at temperatures of thousands of degrees Celsius," he explained. "One of geology's great mysteries is how this lava continues to burn, even though it's submerged in water. The pressure is so immense that it doesn't extinguish the fire." His hands trembled slightly as he typed on his keyboard and brought up video footage from a deep-sea expedition. On the screen, glowing molten rock could be seen pouring out onto the seafloor, like fire burning underwater. "A sight like this," he muttered. "How could anyone have described it over 1,000 years ago?" The room was dead silent. The scientists, most of whom identified as atheists or Christians, had originally entered the lab determined to prove that the Quran was just another ancient book. But the evidence they had uncovered was telling a different story. Dr. Liu lowered his head. "If this is all true, then we've been wrong all along." Professor Zhang looked around at his colleagues, his eyes now moist with emotion. "I never thought this research would change me," he said softly. "I've dedicated my entire life to science. I've always believed everything could be explained through logic and observation. But now, I see something that science alone cannot explain." The weight of his words settled over the room. Some scientists were quietly crying. The emotion was overwhelming. Then Dr. Huang, in a shaky voice, finally spoke. "I want to learn more about Islam." All eyes turned to him. No one mocked. No one laughed. They simply nodded. "Me too," said Dr. Huang. "So do I," added Dr. Chen. One by one, those who had once mocked this project began to feel a shift in their hearts. And then, the moment came, the day that changed their lives forever. In that advanced research laboratory, surrounded by monitors and charts and global data, the same scientists who had once denied faith now stood together in one line. They closed their eyes, took a deep breath, and recited with full sincerity. "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." Tears flowed down many faces. None of them had expected this. What began as a scientific investigation to disprove the Quran had led them to a truth far deeper than data or theories. They had found faith. And in that high-tech Chinese research center, the light of Islam began to shine. That morning, the atmosphere in the lab was different. Where once there were heated debates, busy keyboards, and scientific arguments, now there was a profound silence, filled with meaning. These were scientists who had spent their lives valuing logic above all else. Now, they sat quietly, reflecting on something far greater than science. Professor Zhang stood by the glass wall overlooking the city. The world looked the same, but everything inside him had changed. He whispered to himself, "If the Quran is true, and everything we've found is real, then what does that mean for the way we've been living?" He turned back to his colleagues, emotion in his eyes. "We must admit it," he said. "We've been blind. We've lived in ignorance. But now, we know the truth." The others nodded slowly. "I've always believed that the universe was a result of chance," Dr. Huang said. "But now I feel it. There's a creator behind all of this." "I've looked at the stars through my telescope for years," said Professor Zhang, thinking they were just gas and light. "But now I see them as signs." And then, quietly, one by one, the scientists again repeated the words of shahada. This time, not as an experiment, but as a declaration of faith. In a laboratory once filled with data and debate, now there was peace. They listened to verses of the Quran, not to analyze them anymore, but to understand, to reflect, to believe. In the days that followed, the environment in the lab transformed. Where once there were only scientific journals and research reports, now there were Qurans being studied during breaks. The Quran was no longer just a subject, it became a guide. They began learning how to pray, understanding its purpose, and finding a peace they had never felt before. Professor Zhang, who had once believed only in physics, would often sit alone in the lab, contemplating the greatness of his Lord. As his telescope scanned galaxies far away, he realized, every star, every galaxy, was not just a coincidence. There was a miracle behind it all. There is indeed a Creator who governs every second of life in this vast universe. As news spread about the conversion of several renowned scientists to Islam, curiosity began to stir among their colleagues. Some of them, still skeptical, came forward intending to challenge the findings. But the more who came, the more who ended up walking the same path. What began purely as a scientific investigation had now grown into an unexpected spiritual awakening. Eventually, the research center transformed, not only into a place of scientific discovery but also into a space for seeking deeper meaning. The scientists came to a realization. They had uncovered something far more precious than formulas and theories. They had discovered the very purpose of life. And under the vast sky of China, amid the humming machines and gleaming laboratories, the light of Islam continued to shine, penetrating the hearts of those who once lived in doubt, but who now embraced the undeniable truth. They were no longer just truth-seeking scientists. They had become humble worshippers, bowing before the Creator. From the moment they uttered the shahada, their lives changed drastically. They no longer saw the world through the narrow lens of materialism. Instead, they embraced a greater understanding, that science is not the end, but a means, a path to recognize and appreciate the Creator. Professor Zhang, once a firm believer only in the laws of physics, now often spent his nights in quiet reflection. He would observe the stars through his telescope, no longer just as celestial bodies, but as majestic signs of Allah's perfection in designing the universe. One cannot look at this creation, he once said to his colleagues, and not feel that there's something far greater behind it all. And he wasn't the only one. Other scientists experienced similar transformations. Those who had once dedicated themselves solely to worldly achievements now found themselves drawn to values like compassion, truth, and justice. Their relationships with one another grew more respectful, more sincere, and more filled with love. They began to see their research not as random data collection, but as a mission to uncover the miracles that Allah had placed within His creation. Blessings began to appear in their work. Research projects that had previously stalled or hit dead ends suddenly began to progress. Problems that once seemed unsolvable now had clear solutions. "It feels like I've been given direction," said Dr. Wang confidently, after making a breakthrough in his long-delayed oceanography research. "It's as if there's a light guiding me, showing me where to go." As their personal changes became more noticeable, word of their transformation spread far and wide. Other scientists, intrigued by what was happening, started visiting the research center, not just to witness the science, but to understand the deeper shift that had taken place. Many arrived just to observe. But the longer they stayed, the more drawn they became to what they saw. They watched Professor Zhang and his team work with a calmness and joy that came from something beyond knowledge, something spiritual. They realized that the peace these scientists had found wasn't forced or artificial. It was genuine, a peace they had never known before. Where once the research center had been dedicated solely to scientific advancement, it now pulsed with spiritual energy as well. The Quran was no longer just a book to be analyzed. It had become a source of guidance. Islam had changed them. It made them not only wiser, but better, more humble, more fulfilled, and more at peace than they had ever been before.